Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this impact event hosted by the Sciences Group here at Griffith University. My name's Paul Burton. I'm Professor of Urban Management and Planning and Director of the Cities Research Institute at Griffith University. And I'm delighted, I'm hosting this panel discussion, and I'm delighted to welcome three distinguished guests who are going to share their thoughts with you this afternoon. First, we have Madison Rygrock. Madison's a senior planner with Place Design, a multinational planning and urban design consultancy, and she works out of their Gold Coast office. Maddie has also worked as a planner for the City of Gold Coast. She's president of the Gold Coast branch of the Planning Institute of Australia, and I'm very pleased to say that she's also a graduate of Griffith University's Bachelor of Urban and Environmental Planning program. So welcome, Madison. Matthew Schneider leads the Gold Coast office of Urbis and is a highly regarded and respected planner in the city, not least because of his passion for contributing to the growth and the development of the city in all its senses. Matt chairs the Gold Coast branch of the Property Council of Australia, sits on a number of other local boards, including Study Gold Coast. Matt is also an adjunct industry fellow with the Cities Research Institute here at Griffith. And last but certainly not least, Ben Howe is the founder and CEO of Co-Spaces in Southport and managing director of the Cohort Innovation Space, an amazing and innovative co-working and business incubator space in the Gold Coast Health and Knowledge District. Ben studied at the Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he developed a passion for applying good design principles to the repurposing of workspaces. So those are our three guests. But before we go any further, let me just acknowledge where we're coming to you from, or where I am. I'm coming to you from the shed at the bottom of my garden, which is on the land of the Wanganbarri people of Tamborine. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Kumbameri people on whose lands I usually work when I'm at my Griffith University office on the Gold Coast. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all Torres who are with us today. So let me just begin by setting the scene with some introductory remarks and then put some questions to our guests. We'll do this for about 15 minutes or so. And then take questions from you. And a bit of technicalities, how you can join us in this conversation. We're using a version of Microsoft Teams, and what that does is it allows you to write questions to us. These questions are monitored by my colleagues, Damien and Michaela and Diane, and then they're fed through to us. And I will put these questions on your behalf to our panelists. Because we've got a lot of people registered for this event and attending, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, and we've got a limited amount of time. So I'll acknowledge in advance that we won't probably get a chance to answer each and every question. But if you see a question posted that you think is interesting and relevant and perhaps similar to what you would like to say, rather than asking it again, you can click a thumbs up button, which gives us an indication of how popular that question is, and then we can focus on those in terms of feeding them through to me and me putting them to the panelists. The final thing to bear in mind is that while you can see and hear us, we can't see or hear you. So that might be a bit challenging, but I'm sure we'll make this work. So, and that will allow us to have a decent conversation and a good quality discussion. So that's the technicalities and the welcomes out of the way. Let me just start by making a few introductory kind of opening remarks. And clearly one of the most significant ones, one of the reason we're meeting online rather than in person, which we would otherwise do for one of these impact events, is that we're obviously affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and its associated implications, and in particular the economic crises that we're now in the midst of. And what I think this crisis has revealed and indeed highlighted is many of the inequalities and indeed inequities that have been around for a long time. But what they've done, I think, is shown up some structural weaknesses in our economies, in this city, but in cities in general around the world, and in some of our political systems, how we go about managing and governing ourselves. And what I think is apparent is that many of these inequalities and weaknesses and inequities are most visible in cities, because cities are the places where most of us, we live, we work, we play, we study, we go shopping, and so on. And cities have always been contradictory places. They are places of great opportunity. One of the reasons that cities grow is that people move to cities to try and improve their opportunities in life. But they can also be places of deprivation and indeed disillusionment. Sometimes when we move to cities, we discover perhaps that they're not paved with gold in the way that we thought they might have been before we moved there. And we also know that sometimes while cities are places where economic activity happens and wealth is generated, that's not always shared equally across our cities, and nor have the impacts of this COVID economic crisis. Some have done reasonably well and weathered the storm, and others are experiencing increasingly precarious employment and wage stagnation. That again is not necessarily new, but it's being exacerbated. The other thing I'd say is that a lot of the growth that we have experienced in Australia and in a city like the Gold Coast, a rapidly growing city, is a growth and an associated prosperity that's been driven by population increases, in particular increases in population from net overseas migration. So every year some of us leave the country, but more people have been arriving from overseas. And I speak as a relatively recent migrant. I've lived in Australia for over 12 years now. So I don't, unsurprisingly, see migration as in itself as a problem. But I think that migration and growth fueled by migration and population increase has perhaps masked some relatively poor performance in terms of productivity. So the economy has grown because the number of people in it has grown, rather than because we've been performing a lot better than we have in the past on a per capita basis. So I think what we've got to confront now is that if international net overseas migration begins to slow down, at the moment it's stopped, if it ever recovers, or if it takes a long time to recover, then what will we do in the meantime? What will we do in those industries that rely on people coming here to study, as tourists, to drive the construction sector, and so on? So we've been planning for growth for a long time. And how are we going to adjust to that if we've got a more stable and indeed only a slightly growing, perhaps only a slightly growing population? Now, that may be seen positively as an opportunity for our infrastructure to catch up. It's been a criticism of infrastructure for a long time in Australia, that our infrastructure, our roads, our hospitals, our schools and so on haven't kept pace with population growth. So now might be the opportunity to catch up, but the question is, will we take that opportunity? And when we think about roads and railways, we were just saying before we came on air that the roads are busy again. So are we going to simply return to normal and increasingly go back to driving to work in private vehicles? What's our attitude going to be like towards public transport? Are we going to happily get on buses and trains and metro systems or not? And the final thing I'd say before I open it up to the panelists is that the lockdown has revealed some of the, as I say, underlying structural weaknesses and concerns about how and where we work and where we go shopping, for example. Are we going to continue to go to work, a lot of us, in central business districts, in offices that we pay significant rents to work from? or are we going to start looking to work in a more distributed and decentralized form? What's going to happen to shopping centres that in the past have been charging, fairly high rents? Is that going to change, and what's that going to do to the retail landscape? And if perhaps some firms and some shops go out of business in these shopping centres, whether they're the major refurbished new shopping centres or some of the more dated suburban centres, does that free up space that might be occupied by other people and for other uses rather than just retail and perhaps food outlets? So might those spaces be repurposed into new forms of working spaces? So Ben, you set up very successfully co-spaces in Southport. You're now looking after cohort in the Knowledge Precinct. I wonder what you think about whether there is going to be a significant increase in demand for these kind of co-working spaces similar to the ones that you've established, and rather than just being typically concentrated in kind of central business district type locations, whether you think we might see them more in suburban locations and distributed more around cities generally, but the city of the Gold Coast in particular. So Ben, what do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I think there's so much to talk about, and there's so much that we've been exposed to in the last few months. There's definitely a lot of food for thought, and these conversations are really needed, especially on cities like the Gold Coast, where we're not a typically well-established city. We're growing, we've got growing pains, and we're trying to design our city for the next 50 to 150 years. And it's the decisions we make now that will affect the trajectory of where we go. So in terms of what I do and what I've been involved with for the past decade, we've certainly seen a lot of change in the co-working landscape over the last decade. We started in 2012, so we were almost at the tail end of the GFC. And what we saw was a lot of businesses coming back to the Gold Coast who had left sort of 2008 through 2010, 2012, 2013. They were sort of like, okay, let's dip our toe back in the Gold Coast market, and our co-working solution worked really well. And we had a lot of businesses, especially we've got a panelist today, Matt Schneider, who Urbis was one of our first tenants, and they came in. They started with one desk, went to 3, went to 5, and then went out to their own office of 20, and have just grown significantly in the last few years, and contributed really well to our city. So that's a model that we've seen work in regional areas, but in terms of spaces and co-working spaces, there really is 2 models. There's a major CBD model, which we've seen WeWork. You could arguably say it's successful or not. Well, time will soon tell, I think. But their model really centres around that 2,000 to 6,000 square metres, large floor plates, and that's a way that you can make it stack up, because it's relatively hard to provide all the services that they provide for anything less than 1,500 to 2,000 square metres. So you'll definitely see that model increase and grow. But then for me, the second type is it's a sort of home office slash industrial area slash shared office, where you'll see businesses who they might have their own space, they might have a bit of extra space, they might have a spare tenancy next door, like a spare 100 or 200 square metres, and for them, they might not necessarily make a lot of money out of it, but they've got extra connections. They'll have, they build their own network, they make their own rental sort of outgoings a lot cheaper, and they sort of, and yeah, it sort of makes a lot of sense. So to me, that's the 2 models. The second model doesn't necessarily make a huge profit, but it does give you that increased capacity to bring in new jobs and new connections, and also bring your outgoing costs down. So I see that model growing significantly on the Gold Coast. And then I also see, some relatively strong growth in terms of other office buildings like 50 Cavill Avenue and the Rocket and all these kinds of guys just outlaying maybe 1 or 2 floors in their space that can be utilised more flexibly, because that's where the trend was going, regardless of COVID. There's been significant growth over the past 10 years, and I think we'll have a little bit of a blip here while, there are some restrictions, but as soon as this is lifted, a lot of pundits are tipping there'll be huge growth in the area.
Thank you very much, Ben. One of the things that I mentioned when I introduced you that you'd studied design and looking at design principles and how you apply those to spaces. So as well as the kind of economic and the commercial aspects, I wonder what you think about designing spaces. I've read quite a few pieces that are saying when we return, we'll never return to there'll never be an absolutely post-COVID world that's exactly like it was a year ago. And that some people have said we've seen now the death of the open plan office. I think I find that hard to believe, but I just wonder what your thoughts are on how, from a design point of view, you might reconcile the need, and it might be an ongoing and a perpetual need, to allow space and distance for people who come back into your spaces, but also go there because of the sociability. One of the attractions of having access to places like yours is that you're not like I am at the moment, just sitting in my shed on my own, which is very nice. But sometimes I want to be able to see people and have a chat and have that spontaneity of bumping into people I've never met before. So from a design point of view, I just wonder how you reconcile the two, of the distance and the sociability. Are there any kind of tips and tricks you can offer for somebody who was thinking of setting up a space?
Yeah, well, there's a few we can share, but it's funny to me. So when I first started in 2012, co-working was every second person who came into the office or I'd speak to would say, "What's that? What's co-working? What's that?" And it's sort of the last 3 or 4 years where it's become quite normalised and a normal term where everyone knows what you're talking about. But from where we started to, I would say, maybe 2 to 3 years ago, I noticed a real shift where people were happy with open plan. They in fact preferred it. And it's funny, you see those designs, like you watch movies like The Matrix and those things from the 90s with cubicles. And to me, that just looks so horrendous to sort of be able to hear somebody but not see them. It would just, to me, that would just creep me out. And you saw these, with Pinterest and all these kinds of, different social media platforms, you start to see offices and hospitality venues up their game design-wise enormously. And that's because everyone could see what everyone else was doing. And so offices started to up their game in designs, hospitality venues. I remember hospitality venues 10, 15 years ago, they're nothing like they are today. Like, people put a lot of effort into fit outs. So when we first started, the open plan was very well received, but then I've noticed, especially the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a real step away from that. People are more interested in private offices. They still like the shared facilities and the community aspect to co-working, but there's been a real step away from that. Now, it's interesting because I've been looking at a few different statistics over the last few days, and I was watching different recessions and different downturns in the economy and how that affects real estate. And you'll notice that when there's a downturn in the economy, a lot of offices go back to sort of A grade and prime and step away from premium. But as the economy starts to get better, there's a real increase in uptake in that premium space. And for me, what's interesting and what I suspect is happening is the last few years, the economy's been growing, things have been getting better. People want to step away from that desk in the bullpen, and they want their own space. But I think So in one instance, and obviously, from a hygiene point of view, it's much better to be in a private office. But then if you're combining that with, say, a downturn in the recession, are then people going to be more than happy to go back to that open plan desk where it's going to be more cost effective? So it'll be interesting to see. And I feel like maybe that conversation around the open plan office is dead. I think that changes when you're in a slightly downturned economy. So in terms of other design things, we've had to implement some pretty rigorous controls. We've got quite a few policies. Meeting rooms are obviously the biggest challenge because you're going to have to go to, the 1 per 4 square meters. So the rooms that were typically 8 or so are down to 2, and other rooms are down to 3 or 4. So we have had to, we've had to kind of alter that. But in terms of the 1 per 4 square meter, if you're designing an office for 1 person per 4 square meters, it's, that's not a great design. But what we have done is kind of stagger the desks, so you're not sitting opposite anyone. We're sort of spacing desks between each other, and then different private offices we've had to cut down from, say, sort of 7 to like 5 or 4. So we're just following the guidelines of the Australian Health Organisation and the recommendations. But it's starting to feel normal again, and I'd say this week in particular, it's the first time that it's felt completely like it was pre-COVID. So that's good. Yeah.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. I mean, we're obviously, unsurprisingly, having similar debates and arguments in the university as well about, what about packed lecture theatres, and do we go back to our offices, and if so, when we're designing new space, which Griffith is currently thinking about, what kind of space are we going to design for the university of the future? So one of the things that this crisis has enabled us to do, and in fact kind of forced us to do, is to think rather critically and differently about many of the things that we do, including how, at a kind of high level, how we go about planning our cities and trying to manage them. Now, planning, urban planning, town planning, call it what you will, is sometimes criticised, and we hear these criticisms on the Gold Coast as being too easy on developers. Some people say, developers can get away with things that they shouldn't be able to get away with. On the other hand, if you look from the other side of the table, developers might say, oh, it takes us forever and a day to get fairly straightforward and simple development applications through a complex system. And I think one of the things we have to bear in mind is that, we might generalize about the development sector, but of course it spans an incredible range. I mean, on the one end, at the one end of the spectrum, you've got somebody like Harry Triguboff designing and using his own sources of funding to design and build large apartment complexes. And on the other side of the spectrum, at the other end of the spectrum, you've got mums and dads who maybe want to just split their block and get one more house on it, and who might think that the processes they have to go to seem to take an inordinate amount of time in order to get something pretty straightforward through. So in terms of thinking about doing planning differently, Madison, if I can come to you, and you're somebody who's worked in both the public and the private sector, so you've sat on either side of the table, as it were. I mean, do you think we can go about planning our cities in a different way, and in a way that's better?
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thanks for that introduction and for the invitation to speak today. It's certainly a broad and interesting question, and I'm looking forward to kind of going into it in a bit more detail with you all. Just quickly, before we moved on to that, I did want to just further to what Ben was talking about, touch on my personal experience of working as an office worker during the pandemic. Initially, you can imagine, I thought it was my dream coming true. Yes, I could work at home, fantastic, but it did quickly reinforce the personality type for me, and how social interaction in the workplace actually helps my creativity as a town planner. and the importance of the face-to-face collaboration and discussions that we get to have on a daily basis. So I'm quite intrigued to see how employers will transition back into normal, what we will consider normal, and whether there's an opportunity or flexibility around employers having part-time working from home arrangements into the future. So definitely interesting. But onto what you're asking me, Paul, and as you mentioned, it's always in times in crisis that we do provide us with the perfect opportunity to pause and reflect upon things that we're doing. And for us planners in particular, it provides a golden chance for us to reconsider the things that are working well for us as a city and comparable to other parts of the world. And conversely, the ways we need to reconsider the vision for our city moving forward to ensure that we minimise the vulnerability and improve our adaptability, in the face of future adversity. So given the broadness of the question that you've asked me, today I'll be primarily focusing on, the design of our neighbourhoods and our homes in light of shifting towards medium and high density living in Australia. So density, it's always a hotly debated topic for planners, and that's no different in light of COVID. A key discussion that is on many of our lips is the value versus the risk of densification in the context of COVID. These discussions are often, however, I feel, lost in the discussion against other challenges that we've been working to overcome as an industry, such as shifting towards more sustainable ways of living and reducing our personal footprints. So whilst we think that maybe the concept of moving back towards lower density environments and urban sprawl may assist in minimising the spread of disease, it's important to consider the associated economic implications as well as the social and environmental disadvantages of dispersal. As you'd all be aware, for example, the reduced access to high quality social infrastructure and the ease of transport connections. So densities don't necessarily mean more risk of disease, and we should rather be focusing on the strategies that we're putting into place to manage these types of unpredictable events into the future. So this includes reconsidering how we design our homes, build our environments, and move around our higher density environments. So just touching on the design of our homes, with us all being stuck inside, it's definitely highlighted the flaws in the way we do this. And we do definitely need to reconsider the versatility of our homes to overall improve their utility. So being stuck at home, we've all been aware that, we want access to natural daylight, sunlight, fresh air, good ventilation, good acoustics, and just as simple as having private open space areas for us as well. And I guess with the shift to medium and high density living across Australia, the importance of our flexible floor plans is evident more than ever. So we need to be creating spaces to not only live in, but also for recreation, exercise, to work and rejuvenate. But sometimes I think we forget the simple things like where do we hang our washing if it's raining? So thinking about those spaces in a bit more detail so that we're not impacting the amenity of our living spaces is really important. Just touching on neighbourhood design as well. So with people being stuck at home and within their local neighbourhood, it's reaffirmed the importance of strong local communities and the need for appropriate social infrastructure within walking distance of our homes. As planners, we're often quite mindful of not taking away from the strengths of our district and principal centres as well. So it's a balance of figuring out how we can do that. It's provided planners the opportunities to review and prioritise and reflect upon the importance of our pedestrian and cyclist connectivity in our neighbourhoods, our essential services, and providing spaces for children to play as well. On the Gold Coast, though, the majority of our neighbourhoods are blessed by access to expansive green spaces and to our beautiful beaches as a place of retreat. So that we were really lucky that we had that at our advantage, and our neighbours in Brisbane didn't quite have that same luxury and were itching to get here as quickly as possible. So access to these essential social infrastructure within walking distance and without being dependent on car travel was certainly evident, and this was something that was a bit of a flaw in the way we do things on the Gold Coast through looking at our suburban and our lower density urban neighbourhoods as well. So just quickly before wrapping up on this question, Paul, the other topic that I think would be quite an interesting way in bettering the planning for our cities is technology and the opportunities that comes with it for planners. So the pandemic has created a paradigm shift in this space, and I do believe that we're on the cusp of a leapfrog of a new era of digitalisation. Even simply looking at how we've adapted our work environments, our work meetings, the way we socialise with one another, how we get our groceries and how we do our shopping, just so that we can minimise our exposure to a virus has been remarkable, and I think for many something that we wouldn't have thought we'd be able to do as a community. So recognising all the ways in which technology can be applied to tackle future urban challenges, population growth, climate change, as well as obviously what we're going through with the pandemic and future epidemics that may arise in the future. So I think it's really important that we recognise the technology and the transition to this higher exposure to digitalisation, as a means of providing a more flexible and quicker means of responding to crises in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Maddie. We're gonna touch on some of these in a bit more detail in a moment, talking with Matthew. But I just wanted to follow up one of the aspects, and it's been an important feature and principle of planning for as long as it's been a kind of statutory activity, is public participation, community engagement, both when we are, developing our plans, whether it's for neighbourhoods or cities or indeed, the whole of the South East Queensland region, for example.
Yeah.
And when we determine applications, so when somebody submits a development application, who do we consult with and how do we consult about the detail of what's being proposed? And it's always been a contentious practice. Getting it right, engaging enough people in ways that allow people to think that they're having a good opportunity to have their say, even if they don't necessarily get their own way, but at least have an opportunity to comment, is tricky, without slowing down the process and saying it's going to take 2 years for a small extension on the back of your house to get approval. And I just wonder, because I know there's some issues around at the moment where statutory consultations got to take place, and previously a significant part of that would have been face-to-face. Now it can't be face-to-face, it'll have to be online. I just wonder what you think, Maddie, about how we might do that engagement better, perhaps in a more digital form, whether that's the solution or whether that might disadvantage, and I hesitate to say kind of older people, because I think actually there's a lot of pretty savvy older people out there who are perfectly capable of engaging digitally, and there may be some of the young people who aren't so used to writing an online submission. But is the digital platform, is that the kind of panacea, or do you think we will still need to do face-to-face engagement and do it better when the lockdown ends and we can?
Yeah, that's certainly hit me with another pretty big topic there, Paul. So, and it's one of much controversy, as you were typically saying, for planning, and one of discussion for quite some time. I personally think there's plenty of work that needs to be done to not only improve our engagement with the community as part of plan making processes, but one that we as planners need to work towards better advocacy for our industry and the work that's being undertaken to assist the communities in understanding what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve. And so from my experience working in both the private and public sectors, I do believe there's a significant shortfall in the way that we plan and advocate for planning in both DA as well as plan making. And I think there's a better level of involvement that we need the community, or that we should have with the community. The planning scheme, as many of you would be aware, is the benchmark for what is considered to reflect the public interest. So I'm of the opinion that early and ongoing involvement in city planning provides guidance and direction for what communities wish to see. So we should have that early upfront consultation with them, and strategic planners gives them the opportunity to not only engage with them, but to also propose and explain their policy positions that they're looking to achieve. So that's nothing new for the planners out there as well. Just going to say, as a profession, I think it's important to have these engagement and these strong relationships with the community, because we need to be instilling confidence to them as to what we're trying to do, and what local and state authorities are trying to achieve through their plan making and regulatory frameworks as well, to demonstrate that they are trying to achieve the same underlying factors or underlying things, protecting quality of life in the cities that we love to live in. So just quickly, Paul, sorry, I was just going to say, as you mentioned, I did recently take over the chair of the Gold Coast Peer branch as well. So for those of you out there that aren't familiar with what Peer is, it's the national body representing planners in the planning profession. And our mission is to champion the role of planning in shaping Australia's future through leadership, advocacy and planning education. So the committee on the Gold Coast, we've recently undergone a bit of a restructure, and we're reviewing our focus on how we can better deliver Peer's mission and vision to members and the local community. So we're seeking to engage more closely with our community groups as an independent voice for planning, so not necessarily our developers or our government bodies. And whilst you mentioned, Paul, face-to-face engagement may certainly be difficult in the current climate. You know, we are going to try and find ways to engage and establish this strong foundation in the future to create these meaningful and ongoing partnerships to promote that open dialogue of what planning is and I guess why it matters. So I think, as you said, the technology definitely, you know, your webinars, your presentation forums has a big role to play in being able to do that. And media, whether it be social media or whether it's not a formal platform, yeah, definitely has a big role to play, that's for sure. Just with respect to the DA though, something that I did want to comment, I was reflecting upon public notification requirements, as you were mentioning, Paul. You know, in light of COVID, how do we, you know, better publicly notify if people aren't driving around to see the signs? You know, how do they know what's going on? You know, are we effectively actually communicating you know, development on the Gold Coast if, you know, you don't have access to hard copy newspapers in your local coffee shops? So, you know, there's a bit of opportunity there as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it strikes me that you know, in other spheres, we've got highly developed ways of getting very targeted messages to individuals through various social media platforms, and the kind of, you know, posting a laminated notice on a fence post next to a property is somewhat old school. I wouldn't say get rid of it altogether, but there's opportunities. Let me move on to Matt now. We've touched on some of the things about the public realm. We've had questions about neighbourhoods and walkability, and again, as we talked about with Ben, one of the issues is, you know, to some extent a kind of fear of public space, but on the other hand, missing the opportunity to go to public spaces and socialise and hang out and people watch and things like that. So I just wonder if what your thoughts are as a, you know, leading a planning consultancy on the coast that does a lot of urban design work and thinking about public realm in development projects, what you think we should be focusing on to make those public spaces both safe but also welcoming, and to you know, fulfill that purpose of being the public realm that we like to go to.
Thanks, Paul, and hi everyone. Thanks also for having me along today and being part of what's a great panel and an important conversation. It's all about the public realm. That's where the opportunity is for us as a city at the Gold Coast. As I see it, it's funny reflecting on us being a city of about 61 years in age, beyond our Indigenous forefathers, of course, but as a city only about 61 years old. And if you look at the way that our city has been built as a youthful city, everybody's kind of focused on their own individual project at any one point in time. And I would say that that's at least a consequence of the fact that as the city's built up until the point that we're at now, we haven't felt constrained by available space and other factors which force people to think differently about how the various ingredients of a city can interrelate, which of course happens in the public realm. So I think this is one of the most exciting and, to be frank about it, most crucial parts of the next generation in our city is understanding what that urban realm can contribute. After all, it is the urban realm which is where we kind of live as citizens of a city, and it's the important part of the city, the bit between home and work, where our identity of our city is formed and experienced, both for local residents like ourselves, but importantly for a city like the Gold Coast, tourists don't travel for a tourist experience anymore. They travel for the same experience locals have. So I am looking forward to an increased focus, really the strongest focus we'll have ever seen in this city on the public realm. And I'd encourage everybody involved in working in the built environment to do two things, really. One, focus very much on what distilling the opportunities for that public realm are that are unique to the Gold Coast. There is no point trying to replicate things that fall into the folly of trying to copy what another city does. We can learn from other cities, but there are so many great unique characteristics of this city which the public realm presents an opportunity to celebrate and highlight. And I'd like to see that done. The other thing I think we can do as a city is move to a more nuanced understanding of what the public realm for our city is. Yes, parks are part of it. The beaches are an enormous part of the public realm that we're spoiled to have in this city, as is the hinterland. But as our city moves towards having a population of around about 1 million people in the foreseeable future, the urban spaces, the city spaces are also really important parts of the public realm. And it's interesting to see people start to talk to those kinds of issues, perhaps not articulated in an urban design sense. But you take Surfers Paradise as an example, you know, once the core of activity in this city, and now really at a little bit of a loss for what its own identity within a broader city is, but some fantastic public realm opportunities which are genuinely unique to the Gold Coast as a city by the sea. So exciting times ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. One of the things that strikes me, I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, is that, you know, unfortunately, a lot of enterprises are not going to reopen after the lockdown, and you know, we may well see more empty spaces than we would like to see, whether it's in shopping malls or central business districts or whatever. One of the things that intrigues me is the extent to which we can use that vacant space on a temporary basis. As I'm sure you know, in the city of Newcastle a few years back, they did some really interesting work where they took empty shop spaces and came up with a mechanism that made it very easy for kind of arts, crafts type enterprises, small enterprises just getting going, to use that space on a temporary basis, manage it in ways that meant that the property owners, it was easy for them, and there was a promise that if you need that space, we'll get out. That struck me as a really interesting way of, rather than something sitting empty and perhaps contributing to a sense of long-term and unavoidable decline, that you can get people and activities back into spaces quickly with a promise that, you know, if the space is needed, yeah, there's a mechanism, we'll go, give us 30 days notice and we'll be gone and leave it in good condition. I just wonder if you think that there's scope for that. We did try it on the Gold Coast, but I don't think it went very far. Is now a better time to try and bring that kind of approach back in?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Paul, and I agree with you. I think there is enormous opportunity to explore those kind of applications. I'd hesitate to use even the idea of temporary, because it's illustrative of one of the challenges of doing town planning, as you well know, and that is that there's always a balance between certainty and flexibility. And at one end of that spectrum live the lawyers, and at the other live some good ideas, and finding the right way to chart the course through that spectrum of certainty and flexibility is quite fundamental to the way that we could realise those opportunities. I think it dovetails really nicely with some of the emerging work coming out of kind of the innovation world and startups on the Gold Coast. One that comes immediately to mind is, I'm conscious that there's some quite successful businesses in this city which are looking at developing kind of movable houses, little pods, you know, tiny house kind of things. And it's always struck me that perhaps there might be a good use of some of the big blocks of dirt through our urban areas to actually install some of those innovative housing products, use them as for a commercial benefit to showcase what the city's businesses are capable of doing, perhaps even letting some people who are in need of housing solutions to stay in them at some time, but are very easy to move. I think it's to perhaps segue to a bigger question, which I think picks up some of the threads which I've been really fascinated to see come through in the Q&A. I think the temporary use question goes to the heart of, again, that balancing flexibility and certainty in planning. And that's a really hot button issue in this city at the moment. Without wanting to get too technical for those who aren't kind of town planners on the call, but in Queensland we have a system of doing planning called performance-based planning, and it is a system which, in its most simple forms, tries to provide flexibility by anchoring back to principles. And in my view, it's a good way to do planning. It is a controversial system sometimes, and right now in this city we're seeing a lot of public discourse about whether or not performance-based planning is a good system that serves our city well. But I think it's really interesting to ask ourselves that question collectively against all the other interesting topics that you're talking about today and that we're hearing kind of around dinner tables and barbecues in the city, because the kinds of ideas we're talking about are agile ideas, flexible ideas, good ideas that pop up that need to be actioned quickly and then maybe move on and something else follows through. A performance-based planning system is the best placed system to deliver that kind of flexibility and kind of tension and stretch in the way that our cities operate. And so I think we've got a really interesting conversation coming up in our city about how much we want to maintain that flexibility and how much we feel we need to move to more certainty, more prescription, and more kind of dictation of outcomes for other reasons, and which of those respective approaches or a hybrid of the two best serve our city moving forward, including coming to terms with post-COVID challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I have a kind of bit of a suspicion that sometimes we're in favour of more certainty in relation to planning until it applies to us, until we receive a certain no to our development application, whether it's to, as I say, split our block, or if we're at the other end of the scale to come up with a big scheme. Thank you for those comments. I'm just looking at the questions that are coming through, and actually maybe, Matt, we can stick with you and think about active travel. I mean, and making smaller scale neighbourhoods more attractive and less car dependent. I mean, I wonder if you have views, and it goes back to what you were saying about the public realm, how in practice we make those neighbourhoods better, so that perhaps there are more facilities and services that are accessible via a 30-minute walk or a 15-minute cycle ride that mean we don't have to get in the car, and what we can do practically to make that 30-minute walk or 15-minute bike ride more enjoyable and safe, so that we don't go, that's too difficult, I'm just going to get in the car.
Yeah, this is a great question. I would say, as kind of context to this, I think one of the consequences of COVID is what I would describe as an acceleration of a trend to being hyper-local, and that's not just in this city, but it's very much in this city as well. I mean, our foundations as a city were a series of coastal fishing villages, effectively, and what we've seen over the kind of the gestation of the city to its current state is really kind of a washing through and a blending of characteristics, and we've lost, I think, in some parts of the city, the fine-grained qualities, which are the bits that people actually like to live and work in. And I think we were already starting to see a trend back to an appreciation for those neighbourhood qualities at all levels. I think there's less controversy about this than people sometimes suggest, but certainly COVID has accelerated that because people have been forced to spend more time in their neighbourhoods, and so I think that's ultimately a good thing. The question of accessibility and walkability is a great one for this city. We're a flat city in a subtropical climate. Some of this should be a no-brainer. I think the double barrel questions, though, we need to ask ourselves both as a profession and a city are these. First of all, part of making our neighbourhoods better connected and more walkable is about building infrastructure like cycleways and parkways and upgrading roads so they're safer. they're really expensive things to do, and they take a very long time to do. And our approach for a long time has been an expectation, rightly or wrongly, that government bears the cost for that, providing our rates and taxes don't go up too much. And we've tried public-private partnerships as a means of delivering this infrastructure, and it hasn't quite worked. What's also not well understood is that a lot of the infrastructure in cities is actually developed by private developers as part of overall projects. So one part of the answer to this question is, yes, it's a great objective and we should aim to get there, but how do we fund it? And is that going to come from the public sector or the private sector? And what trade-offs and questions do we need to ask ourselves about that? The flip side to deal with the accessibility of neighbourhoods is to focus less on spending money about how to connect people elsewhere and bring more into the local neighbourhood. And again, I think, there's some benefits and weaknesses to that approach. But again, if I look at some of the projects that I work on, both either consulting to council or for private developers in this city, one of the most controversial things I'm often asked to do is to try and get approval for a non-residential use to go into a residential suburban area, even shopping centres and car parking impact and those things. So both of these questions, or both of those kind of answers to the question raise really important issues, and they're not just issues for the profession, they're questions for us as a city as well that we need to come to terms with. And the answer to making our neighbourhoods more accessible and more walkable lies in the answer to those two questions.
Yeah, it's interesting as a planner. We know that the planning profession emerged principally in response to some of the kind of congestion that we saw in industrial cities of Europe and the United States 150 years ago, where people typically, they lived above the shop or the workshop. It all happened. A lot of industrial processes actually happened within the household, and that wasn't necessarily very nice. And we've gone for a lot of separation of uses now, and trying to bring, I think you're absolutely right, Matt, trying to bring some uses other than residential back into residential areas, in my view, will introduce a greater diversity that would be welcome. And in relation to one of the questions that's been posed about whether the current crisis, COVID-19, presents an opportunity to think more about resilience, I mean, in my view, I think having more diversity, perhaps mixed uses, a more diverse economy is the way to go in terms of resilience. The most unresilient things are things that are very specialized and dependent on one activity. So if your economy is totally dependent on foreign tourists and something like this happens, then you've got a problem. If it's totally dependent on building new houses and population growth stops, then you've got a problem. So it's not to say that we get out of tourism, but perhaps thinking about different forms and different forms of construction and building different things.
Can I get in on that one, Paul? Can I?
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. Yes.
Yeah, for me, looking as a designer who works in a different field to planning, I don't understand how in the world technology has gotten better, we've gotten smarter at everything, but in planning it, we seem to have gotten worse. Like if you look at the Gold Coast as an example, you look at the oldest neighbourhoods in the Gold Coast, you've got Southport, Burleigh and Coolangatta. All of them have those village central streets like you were just describing, where the people worked and then they lived up, and the sort of that was the centre, and the residential sprawled out from that, and it was all walkable. It was livable, and you could utilise it. And if you look at now, you go down James Street on Burleigh, shops are thriving. Guess what? The square metre rate is through the roof. It's the highest on the Gold Coast. Why? Because they get customers. And then a prime example for Southport is it's a suburb that they have wrecked through terrible design. And you see it with the light rail going through, it's taken out car parks. And if I speak to a modern day planner, they say, oh, and they laugh at me and they scoff and they say, Ben, we don't want to design car parks. We want with the light rail, we want this and we want that. But the fact is, as soon as you take those car parks out, those shops all close. That's what happens. So for me, and then a prime case in point is Palm Beach at the moment. You've got Palm Beach, which in my opinion you should have the Gold Coast Gold Coast Highway and Palm Beach Avenue should be the village centre of that suburb. But now we're approving these residential towers of up to 10 stories, and each one of them has a commercial basis on the bottom. And if you go and speak to any bar owner or any business owner, I spoke to one of the bar owners down there and I said, oh, that's great. You've got a 10-story building coming in. That's going to be more people. That's going to be thingy. And he said, oh, yeah, it's great. Except the fact is they're going to put in, 10, 20 shops down below it. And there's going to be more competition for me. So I don't understand why it's so hard, but typical Gold Coast problem. We spread things too far, spread it too thin, and then nothing works for everyone. Where we've got to go back to the drawing board and say, let's densify, let's make that thing work. And each suburb is different, but then we need to actually say that the mandate for that suburb is for this, Southport, CBD should be. But we seem to compete, each suburb competes with each other. And that's why when you were speaking about Renew Newcastle was specifically to renew the CBD, a specific small area of Newcastle, and it worked very well. But the problem is it's shut down, I think, last year or 2 years ago. Really hard to get the funding for that. But the problem with the Gold Coast is why that doesn't work is because they try and renew the whole Gold Coast. It's way too big. You need to specifically focus on one area and get that right. And it needs to be a clear objective with why you're doing it. But for me, from the design point of view, it's like form follows function. What's the function? What's the design outcome we're after? It just seems a like spray approach. And I find that's a problem with cities, and I find that's a problem with a lot of what we're trying to do on the Gold Coast at the moment. So yeah. I feel like, I don't know, you guys are planners. Why was it better? Why were streets wider and things done properly 100 years ago? Whereas now it just doesn't seem to be like that from somebody looking from the outside in.
So Maddie, contemporary modern planner, what's the problem? What are you guys doing? Why isn't planning sorting these things out? And is it because 100 years ago there weren't any planners? And I mean, do you kind of understand and sympathise with what Ben's saying, or and if so, how should the planning profession, you chair the Gold Coast branch of PIA, what would you be saying to the planners, a lot of whom are youngish planners, so they're the next generation that are going to be occupying the senior roles in years to come? Are they up for that challenge or what? You're on mute, Maddie.
Sorry, my apologies. I think Ben really did. Yeah, he nailed it in saying, we are really stretching out these facilities along, in different areas, which is why I guess when I was talking to, we do need to further improve our services and infrastructure within our neighbourhood centres, whilst also being mindful, I guess, of, building up our areas that are intended to be CBGs or, your district centres. So it's about putting these facilities in these kind of neighbourhood suburbs without taking away from the function and profitability for these smaller or for these other businesses in our centres is probably my thoughts. But yeah, it's definitely one. I think the councils are aware of it. We're constantly being hit up with when we are proposing, as Matt said, these commercial developments or smaller commercial developments in our suburbs for justifying why it needs to go in there. So I think it's definitely at the forefront of our discussion for sure.
So Matt, do you have anything to add? Because you're a planner as well, and your thoughts on that? Do you think we're as a profession is planning up to the challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Ben makes some excellent points. I kind of alluded to it earlier. I do think we've been trying to paint the picture of the Gold Coast with brush strokes, which have been a bit too broad for a while. And I'm a strong advocate for bringing back some nuance and kind of hyper localness to parts of our city. And of course, that approach needs to be undertaken against the background of a strategic view which pulls all the threads together so that we understand what's working well. The other thing I'd say, I think Ben's points highlight really well though, are that planning isn't a static kind of moment in time, and managing the actual kind of time frame of the change process is also really important. The car parking to light rail one's a perfect example of this, right? Because, you know, we're a city which kind of had a deficit of good public transport. The light rail system is an excellent piece of public transport infrastructure that's safe, efficient and reliable. But we can't jump from no public transport to public transport on a designated day. And so the trick is striking the right balance as the city moves from car parking dependence in some parts of the city to public transport principally, but always kind of maintaining some kind of contingency wrapped around the outside. So I think particularly for the Gold Coast as a city, which is a fast growing city, I still think it will continue to grow quite quickly. But a city which is not a capital city and needs to come to terms with its kind of rates base and its economy and all of those things, keeping a razor sharp focus on how we manage that actual change process as well as the outcomes we're trying to achieve is the really important task for planners, and it is a discussion that needs to involve the community as a whole.
Yeah, thank you very much. Look, I'm conscious of time, and we've come to the end of our allotted hour. So thank you, Ben and Matthew and Madison, for your contributions. I'm just going to give a couple of closing remarks here. And the first one is, of course, that cities are huge and varied. We've focused on the Gold Coast. Been a few references to what's going on in other places. There have been some questions about why might we not be able to do things in ways that are more commonplace in European cities, which I understand. But I think there are some dangers about saying, oh well, that works really well in Barcelona or Copenhagen or Paris. Let's copy it here because it's a very different environment, and sometimes things don't transplant very easily. But there's a whole host of topics we could have talked about. We haven't talked much. We've touched a bit on transport and public transport and the balance between, meeting the needs of car drivers and those who might not want to or are able to drive around. As I said before, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how and whether we return to an appetite for using public transport, if that means going on a crowded train or tram or bus. I'm intrigued also the government recently announced, I think it was last week, the construction sector stimulus with the home builder grant, which is very welcome. Is very welcome by the construction sector, but I think it raises a question about whether we should be concerned with not just the stimulation of the construction industry, which is important, but what they're constructing. So do we care whether they're just building houses or renovating houses, or do we want to use that stimulus in perhaps new ways and say, actually now would be the time to invest in the delivery of, whether that's through new construction or conversions and renovations of existing property into more social housing, because we know there's a massive crisis, and again COVID has highlighted the challenges of affordability, especially for younger people trying to get into the market. So do we want to think about what we spend our construction stimulus on? There's also been talk, and we've touched on it a bit, and you guys have touched on it, about the kind of regulation and red tape. We've heard senior politicians, the governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia talked about a bonfire of red tape. And many of us would say, well, that's a good thing. We want to get rid of red tape. But on the other hand, we want to get rid of unnecessary red tape. And of course, the trick is to distinguish between what might be unnecessary and what is necessary. I mean, we're about to start a big new research project on regulation within the construction industry and building standards. I'd be very nervous if during the bonfire, and excuse the pun, of red tape, we got rid of regulations that determine what you can clad high-rise buildings in. And if we said, we don't care whether you clad high-rise buildings in flammable material, that's something for you guys to sort out, that would be very worrying. We might be worried about regulations that limited what you can do with heritage listed buildings. We don't necessarily have a wealth of heritage listed and certainly old heritage listed buildings on the Gold Coast, but would we want it to be made easier to get rid of historic buildings? Perhaps not. So just in conclusion, I mean, these are, and it's become a cliche, but these are unprecedented times. We don't know how we are going to emerge, what it's going to be like as the lockdown eases. All I can say is that, you know, we're moving into that world at a faster rate than many other places. I was speaking to my mother on the phone in England last night, and you know, they're still seriously locked down, and if they were to allow some of the things that we can do now, then it would probably have somewhat disastrous consequences. So when they emerge, it will be later and more challenging. So we're in a lucky position. We've got these opportunities to review what we do, why we do it, and how we do it. I think the question remains of whether we grasp those opportunities. I remain hopeful that we will grasp them. I hope you share my optimism that we've got the potential to do things differently and to do things better and to take whatever steps are necessary to make that optimism a reality. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists, Madison, Matt, and to Ben for sharing their thoughts, to my colleagues, Damien, Michaela, Diane, for operating things smoothly in the background, and thank you to all those who registered and attended. And sorry we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but I'm pleased that there was such interest and enthusiasm to join in an event like this. And I hope the next time we do something similar, we might be able to do it face to face and in slightly more congenial circumstances. So until then, thank you very much. Cheers and stay safe.
Thanks, guys.